The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining the North American Carbon Offsetting webinar. We're just going to wait a few more minutes for anyone else to log in. So please just sit tight, and in 2 or 3 minutes, we're going to start the webinar. Thank you. Thank you once again, and welcome to our webinar on North American offsetting trends. If you can't stay for the entire webinar, or if you have colleagues who can't make it, don't worry. We will be recording this webinar, and we'll be making it available at foresttrends.org, hopefully by this Thursday. So I will begin this webinar by sharing our regional offsetting insights for North America based on 2 reports that came out in 2017. The first being our State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Regional Analysis Report, and the second being our State of Forest Carbon Finance 2017 report. Following me will be 4 panelists: Phil Cole of Nature Bank, Bill Drumheller of Washington State's Department of Ecology, Sheldon Zakreski of the Climate Trust, and Alistair Hanley of Carbon Credit Solutions. They will speak more about their specific experiences with either the voluntary or compliance markets in Alberta, British Columbia, California, Oregon, and Washington. We should, if everything goes to plan and we all stick to our speaking times, have about 10 minutes at the end of this to answer questions. So if you do have any questions during the webinar, please write them down in the question box that you should see on your screen here. So you can write them down throughout the webinar, and then we will try and address all of them at the end of it. So before I begin, I'd like to recognize the supporters and sponsors of these 2 reports. All of our reports are freely available, and it is thanks to sponsorship that we can make that be the case. So thank you. For those of you unfamiliar with Ecosystem Marketplace, a brief background. We're a program of the nonprofit Forest Trends, and we produce reports and articles covering the latest in ecosystem markets and conservation finance. So this webinar is about offsetting trends in the US and Canada, but we also had webinars the last 2 weeks that covered trends in Oceania and Latin America. So if you're interested in viewing those, please visit our website. They're listed on the same landing page as the State of Forest Carbon Finance 2017 report. And then just a quick recap of where the data is coming from for this presentation. The voluntary carbon offset information will come from the report on the left, the State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets 2017 report. And then the forest carbon compliance offset information will come from the report on the right, the State of the Forest Carbon Finance 2017 report. So for this presentation, I will only be discussing developments in the US and in Canada. We include Mexico in Latin America, so that was covered in the webinar last week. So what this slide shows are the different types of markets for forest carbon offsets in North America. As you can see by the pink outlines, voluntary offset trading can happen anywhere. However, compliance markets, at least for right now, only exist in certain states and provinces in the US and Canada. So for my presentation, I'm going to first focus on voluntary carbon offset findings for this region, and then turn to discuss some of the compliance market trends in select states and provinces at the end of my presentation. So we're switching gears a little bit. So this is a slide that just shows all voluntary offset data, not just forest carbon offset data. And it shows 2016 transaction data for all voluntary offsets. So if I keep saying last year, what I mean is 2016. I haven't quite caught up with the new year yet. And as you can see here, survey respondents reported transacting 10.1 million tons of offsets from projects based in North America. This comprised 22% of all offsets we tracked on the global market in 2016. And nearly all of these offsets came from the United States. So 10 million tons were transacted from the US, and only 0.1 million tons came from projects based in Canada. However, there's a difference in terms of average price. Average Canadian prices were $11 per ton, which was much higher than the $2.8 per ton average price for US offsets. However, again, the volume was only a fraction of what was tracked in the US. We think that the price discrepancy is in part due to the variation in project categories between the two countries. So forestry offsets dominated the Canadian market, whereas the US market was more evenly split among several project categories, including offsets from methane projects, transportation projects, gas projects, and also forestry and land use projects. So this shows a bit more of a deep dive of what we tracked going on in the US last year. So as you can see from the table, methane projects were the largest source in terms of the volume of offsets transacted. So 43% of all offsets that we tracked transacting in the US in 2016 came from methane projects. Most of these specifically came from landfill methane projects. So these are projects that typically appeared in the late 2000s in anticipation of a US-wide cap and trade program, which of course never materialized. They also were never included in California's cap and trade program, so many of the project developers turned to look for voluntary buyers and now occupy a substantial portion of the market. Following methane, 22% of offsets sold in 2016 came from transportation projects. However, these were at very low prices, so they only made up 2% of the total value tracked in 2016. Conversely, forestry and land use offsets showed the opposite trends. While consisting of only 13% of the total market volume in the US, they earned 39% of the total market value. Most of these offsets came from improved forest management projects, but there were also a substantial amount of afforestation, reforestation offsets represented, as well as some rice and urban forestry offsets. And this is actually the first year that we can report on urban forestry offsets being transacted, which is quite exciting. So speaking of forestry, basically many of the forestry carbon methodologies were adopted for use in the California cap and trade program. So this includes improved forest management, urban forestry, and rice cultivation. So there's really sort of an interesting dynamic between the California market and the US voluntary market. And the California's Air Resources Board continues to follow the development of new voluntary methodologies. There haven't been any new ones that have been adopted recently in California. The latest was the rice cultivation methodology back in 2015. So we don't really have a sign of what they might consider in the future, but that was sort of a linkage that I wanted to point out here. And then also, as you can see on the slide, this shows a map of forest carbon projects in the US and their intended markets. So as you can see here, there's a lot of overlap in locations that have projects that are intending to sell offsets in the voluntary or in the compliance markets. And in particular, you see that there's quite a lot of forestry projects in the southeast of the United States. This is something, however, that might change a little bit in the future. Last year, legislators voted to extend the California program through 2030, but they also included some new offset rules that might encourage more projects to be developed only within the state of California or perhaps just in nearby states. So that's something that we might sort of see a shift in the future. So shifting now to look at a compliance market, in particular the California Cap and Trade Program. This is just focused on forest carbon offsets associated with the California market. We don't track other compliance offset types. But as you can see here, there are a couple of things that we tracked going on in the California program. The first is that the role of forestry within California offsets is quite large. So 65% of all offsets issued by the California Air Resources Board represent forestry projects. And in 2016 in particular, we tracked a record high of California eligible offsets being issued in 2016. So a quick note on what I mean by California eligible offsets. The Climate Action Reserve and the American Carbon Registry are both California approved offset project registries, which means that they can issue eligible California offsets. However, the California run Air Resources Board has ultimate say over what offsets are allowed in the program. So of the 31 million tons issued by CAR and ACR, 41% of ACR offsets were canceled and reissued on the California registry, and 85% of CAR offsets were canceled and reissued, once again on the California registry. Also in 2016, we tracked 4.1 million tons transacted. This was a decline from what we tracked the previous year, which was 6.5 million tons. But we don't view this as cause for alarm. I think internally we missed one major supplier's data. We didn't manage to collect it last year, and I think that would have sort of filled that gap that happened between the 2 years. And then also in terms of the offsets surrendered, California only reports on this at the end of each compliance cycle. So you can see that in the 2013 to 2014 period, a bit over half, or about half, 5.9 million tons of offsets were surrendered that represented forestry offsets. And so far we don't have access to the 2015 through 2017 data, but hopefully we will see what that looks like sometime this year. So that's it in terms of the offset market data that I wanted to share from our reports, but we also did sort of provide an overview and some information on what else is happening more on the policy side of things in the US and in Canada. So you can see here, these are different markets that allow for forest carbon offsets in the US and Canada. One is Alberta. Alberta had a carbon competitiveness incentive regulation that actually just started January 1st of 2018. It replaced their old regulation, which was the specified gas emitters regulation. And basically it says any organization emitting more than 100,000 tons must reduce their emissions, or they could also pay a flat rate to a fund, or they can purchase offsets. And this program has a couple of different forestry and land use related protocols. However, right now, pretty much all of them are undergoing revisions, and there's only one that is active, which is called conservation cropping. In British Columbia, the government, as well as compliance and voluntary buyers, can purchase offsets on the British Columbia Offset Registry. And there are 4 different forestry project types that are allowed in that program. And then in California and Quebec and Ontario, so my previous slide was only talking about California and Quebec because Ontario didn't officially join until last year. But there are, of course, forestry methodologies and forestry offsets active within that market. And at the moment, just California has methodologies for forestry projects. However, both Ontario and Quebec are working with the Climate Action Reserve and are thinking about adapting several voluntary protocols. So it's unsure sort of which ones that they have decided yet, specifically, especially in Ontario. We're not sure which ones will be sort of allowed in, but that's something to look out for this year, because hopefully they will be releasing that information soon. And then finally, I won't spend as much time on Oregon, but Oregon has a carbon dioxide standard passed in 1997, which requires new energy facilities in the state to meet an emission standard 17% below best existing plants in the US. And effectively what this means is that these power plants either have to adopt mitigation technologies on site, purchase offsets from projects that they build, or provide funding to a state-recognized nonprofit that will manage carbon reduction projects on their behalf. And so far, there's only one nonprofit that has the state recognition, and that's the Climate Trust. So we will have Sheldon speak a little bit more about that and some other things later on. And then finally, in Washington, in 2016, the Clean Air Rule was passed, and it started in 2017. And this essentially established an emission standard to cap and reduce emissions from in-state non-mobile sources and a couple of other places. And essentially, it also allows for some of these entities to use emission reduction units from offset projects in the state of Washington. So all very exciting things. We're also keeping our eye on a couple of upcoming potential developments listed here. The first is that in Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau is requiring all provinces to enact a carbon tax by 2018. And while Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick have created plans, they don't meet federal requirements. And 2 other provinces haven't even made a plan yet. So that's something that, there might be some decisions made this year about what's happening with those areas. And then also, there are a couple of states that have some things going on here in the US. Massachusetts wants to start an emissions trading scheme in 2018. Virginia wants to join RGGI. New Jersey might want to rejoin RGGI. And RGGI is, typically we haven't really focused on it in our reports because there's been no offsetting in RGGI. However, as the allowance prices have started to go up, we did see the very first offset issuance in RGGI, so this might be something that could potentially take off more in the future. And then also in Oregon, they just introduced a new bill to enact a cap and trade program. And so then finally, I just wanted to sort of finish my presentation with a couple of sort of bigger picture on the horizon things that we're keeping our eye on. The first is America's Pledge, which is an initiative to aggregate and quantify all U.S. state, city, and other actors' commitments around climate change. There's no sort of specific role in the use of offsets yet, but that is something that we, are hoping we might see that in the future. Also, last year, California and Norway signed a declaration of intent to collaborate with Mexico to try and reduce emissions from forest and land use and to pilot long-term financing of REDD+ through markets. California has for a long time sort of thought about perhaps trying to include REDD offsets in their markets, but we haven't seen a lot of progress on that recently. So that was sort of an interesting thing to see. Oops. Let me go back. Oh, apologies, everyone. I see that the audio ceased. I should be back online. I just am sharing screens with Phil Cole, and he will be presenting about his experience with Nature Bank. Let me see.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yeah, I can hear you and see your screen.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks to Kelly and thanks to Ecosystem Marketplace for having me. My name is, as Kelly said, is Phil Carl. I'm the CEO of the North American operations of Nature Bank. Firstly, I will say a quick word about Nature Bank. We always have to get our plug in. We're involved in a number of areas globally, all related in varying degrees to climate change mitigation and adaptation. We've been active in the voluntary carbon market since 2006, and we're also active in the BC, Alberta, and California compliance markets. Our headquarters are in Vancouver, and we've got offices in Portland, Bonn, and Zurich. Okay, so today I'm going to focus on the jurisdictions of BC and Canada, mostly focusing on the regulatory carbon pricing schemes that are either in place or under development. But first, a quick word on the voluntary markets in Canada. Voluntary purchases in Canada are still fairly limited, though there are a number of companies, certainly many of our clients, that are very engaged and committed. Canadian voluntary projects are quite scarce. For example, there are only 6 Canadian VCS projects listed on the VCS project database, and that has around about 1,400 projects on it. And on closer inspection of those projects, 2 of them have never listed, and 1 of them is no longer in operation. There are more projects on the CSA, Clean Projects Registry, which is very Canadian focused, but we at Nature Bank have found that our clients are less likely to use that, as it's not internationally recognized. Many of the voluntary buyers in BC use the provincial standards for purchasing their offsets. Currently, there is also an early stage consultation with the province of Ontario, who have committed to develop, and I quote, a quality branded voluntary offset class for use by government and the private sector. Personally, I've suggested, and we have suggested through the consultation process, that we have a lot of standards already, and we should probably be focusing on using those and concentrating on driving demand. But we'll see where that goes. Right. So if I move onto the regulatory side, federally in Canada, climate policy is in a pretty exciting place at the moment. After many years of conservative inaction under Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau's Liberals have been much more active on the file, despite not actually raising the commitment to emission reductions, but they are doing much more in order to get to the reductions they've committed to. At the end of 2016, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change was established. And basically this says that the provinces and territories that do not have carbon pricing legislation in place that matches or is above the federally mandated price, the federal government will enforce that price is paid. It's been referred to as the backstop. This consists of a carbon tax on fossil fuels of $10 per ton in 2018, which is escalating by $10 per year out to $50 in 2022. It also has a regulatory framework governing large industrial facilities greater than 50,000 tons of CO2e per year, which is called the output-based pricing system. This system focuses on reducing emissions while maintaining competitiveness, and has 5 main design principles, which are listed on the screen there. Deliver incremental greenhouse gas emission reductions, minimize carbon leakage and competitiveness risks, treat participants in a consistent manner, provide transparency, and has a commitment to review. So there's nothing really controversial there, but it's also still missing at the moment a lot of the detail. We know that one of the compliance options under the system will be offsets. That's part of the plan, but we don't know much more than that at this stage. So as you can probably gather, we don't exactly know how this system is going to really work yet. 2 important drafts were released for public comment on the 15th of January. And there's a huge amount of work being undertaken by the provinces and the federal government to implement these and other complementary policies. Okay, so I'll skip on to British Columbia. We've also had a change in the political landscape in BC. John Horgan's NDP and Andrew Weaver's Greens have formed a coalition government. Prior to Weaver turning to politics, he was the Canadian Research Chair in Climate Modelling and Analysis at the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Victoria. So it seems fairly reasonable to imagine that he'd have carbon pricing pretty high on the agenda. And indeed, it was one of the first things that the new government committed to, was to raising the carbon tax, which had been languishing under the Liberals at $30 by $5 a ton each year until it hits 50. You can see from the small graph in the corner of the slide there that keeps them ahead of the federally mandated carbon tax. They've also made some noises about increasing emission reduction targets. And then one thing they did that was very interesting was that they have removed the revenue neutral requirement of the carbon tax, which allows them to now actually spend it. That hasn't formally been through the legislature yet, and exactly how it will be spent is up in the air, but the government has indicated that it will be used to reduce financial impacts of the tax on low-income households, help insulate industry in BC from competitiveness issues, and third, to invest in green infrastructure projects. However, the offset market continues to stagnate under the new government. There had been an expectation of more demand from offsets in the province coming from LNG developments, but there have been no LNG developments, and none are really expected at the moment. The NDP seem more receptive to LNG than many had thought, but the Greens are insisting that the coalition will fall apart if they go down that route, and they've been using some pretty strong language. A tweet from Andrew Weaver: if the BC NDP caucus continue the generational sellout embodied in the LNG folly of the BC Liberals, their government will fall. So the future for the for LNG in the province is pretty uncertain at the moment. And so that leaves the offset market really with only the provincial government under their carbon neutral government program as the only buyer. And without any new demand, the existing projects in the province are sufficient to service their needs, which are around 650 to 700,000 tonnes per year. So that's led to no real incentive for the current program to be developed further. And currently, 2 years after the Greenhouse Gas Reductions Targets Act was replaced by the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act, in anticipation of LNG, we still have no protocols and no way of actually doing any projects. So recently the fuel switch protocol was out for public comment, but with very little demand. It seems a little futile at the moment. On the slightly more positive note, the National Energy Board has included offsets as a condition in their environmental approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So that could lead to a new source of demand, though it would be one-off as it's only related to its construction emissions. So now a brief pan-Canada view. This is a table showing the provinces and territories, their relative contribution to the 2015 greenhouse gas emissions and their carbon pricing regulations. I'm not going to go into these in great detail. I'm sure Alistair will be covering Alberta later on. And this also isn't an exhaustive list of all the policies that are out there. But I did want to demonstrate that carbon pricing is indeed happening in Canada. Over 80% of the emissions are already captured, and that's only going to go up. The problem for Canada is really boiled down to one word, and that's equivalence. That's where all the work is being put in. The federal backstop is great in principle, but the mechanism of deciding if the particular climate policies in each province are meeting that price, if offsets and/or allowances will be tradable across provincial systems, and of course we've got that link to California for the WCI provinces as well. Well, this is where the rubber really hits the road. From a carbon trading perspective, we know that industry is keen on offsets being a compliance option, that the backstop legislation envisages it, at least for part of the scheme, and that Quebec, Ontario, BC to some degree, and Alberta will all have offset markets. So we are cautiously optimistic that there's going to be a vibrant market unfold across Canada. That's with the emphasis, though, on cautiously. So I'm gonna stop there. I think I'm just about over my time, but I look forward to answering some questions later on.
Thank you so much, Phil. And I really like the graph right there. I sometimes have a hard time trying to keep track of everything that's going on in Canada at the moment. But we're going to move on really quickly to Bill Drumheller, who is a climate and energy specialist at the Washington Department of Ecology. And I'm just going to change my screen really quickly back to my presentation. In just a minute, Bill, I think you're muted. Okay, try speaking again now.
Great. Thanks, Kelly, and thanks for the opportunity to get you all up to speed on what's happening in the state of Washington. Kelly mentioned the Oregon carbon dioxide standard. It's important to note that Washington also has a very similar standard. Actually, in fact, it was modeled after the Oregon standard. And that's been in place since the early 2000s, requiring that new power plants in Washington mitigate 20% of their carbon dioxide emissions. Mitigation is typically done through the offset market, and like Oregon, through the Climate Trust, which is one of the key providers and the only real active provider for that program in Washington. That program currently applies to 2 power plants, although one is on sort of a conditional status and it rarely applies. Bottom line is, the Climate Trust has actually procured about 250,000 offsets to cover the obligation of one of the major power plants covered by that program. So it's not nothing. Really, I think a lot of, and Kelly mentioned, the kind of a lot of the news around Washington, especially in the last year, has been around our clean air rule. That was put in place in 2016, started in 2017. What that is, it's a regulatory cap on the state's largest emitters. So we began implementing it again at the beginning of this year. And so industrial sources, petroleum fuel producers and importers, and natural gas distributors must reduce it's a cumulative 1.7% of their baseline emissions annually. Just to clarify, Kelly mentioned that mobile sources aren't affected, but we do get transportation fuels upstream at the refinery. So those responsible for at least 100,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases per year are affected by the program. That actually drops down to 70,000 tons by 2035. So it's a declining threshold there. So those covered by the rule can comply by reducing their own emissions, buying credits from other regulated parties, or from projects that reduce emissions, or by acquiring allowances from approved cap and trade programs. So quickly, 3 key points about this program, I think often not fully understood. First, it's a baseline and credit program. It's not an allowance-based cap and trade system, so there are no allowances to trade with other systems. The program really doesn't create a new carbon market by itself. Rather, it's leveraging the existing carbon market that supports the voluntary market, the carbon dioxide standard that I just talked about, and other existing programs. So it uses existing protocols from the Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry, potentially the Verified Carbon Standard, and so on and so forth. And perhaps most importantly, it's focused on emission reductions in the state of Washington, so that has some important implications. So that means no emission removals like forestry and soil sequestration, and also the projects have to be located in the state of Washington. However, for those of you who haven't heard, on December 15th of, I guess, last year now, a Superior Court judge made a bench ruling the state did not have the authority to regulate indirect emissions. What that means is basically the petroleum fuel and natural gas portions of the rule. And actually those emissions comprise about 3/4 of the covered emissions that are in the program. The judge did agree to take briefings on whether the rule is severable, meaning that the portion of the rule that applies to stationary sources, factories, power plants, that kind of thing, may still be considered valid. Initially, he ruled the entire rule invalid. So the bottom line for now, the compliance requirements of the Clean Air Rule have been suspended. We have not yet gotten a final written order from the judge that will hopefully clarify the legal status of the rule. But we're obviously anxiously awaiting that sort of final word. Finally, I'd like to talk about what I think is the most exciting part about what's happening in Washington. And I think it's sort of a new trend really potentially throughout the country, at least portions of the country. And that's greenhouse gas mitigation under our state's Environmental Policy Act. So, a lot of people are familiar with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and mitigation requirements under NEPA. Washington is one of the few states with a state environmental policy act, a SEPA, California being, I think, probably the most well-known one. You can think of it like a supplemental NEPA, but with a focus on state of Washington impacts. So, several large energy-focused projects here in the state have included greenhouse gas impacts in their environmental impact statements. So, not just the direct emissions or project-level emissions. These are, indirect emissions and even global emissions from shipping or combustion of their products. Two recent examples here are an oil by rail facility that's been proposed in the southern part of Washington. And the project proponent there actually walked in sort of the door offering greenhouse gas mitigation through offsets from the very beginning of that project. Another one that's gotten national news is the Millennium Bulk Coal Export Terminal. This is a kind of a really big facility that would take coal from the middle part of the country and ship it, serve as a terminus to ship that to Asia. And in the EIS that was the final EIS for that project, there was required GHG mitigation of 2 million metric tons a year from 2028 through 2038. So again, I'll repeat that: 2 million metric tons a year. That's a whole lot of mitigation. That said, both these cases and other similar cases are currently tied up in litigation. So there's nothing. These haven't been finalized. But I think the key takeaway here is this is a really kind of new and exciting side to carbon offsetting. And, at least here in the state of Washington, I think it's an area that's only expected to increase in sort of size and visibility as more and more projects come on board with, either offering or being required to mitigate their GHG impacts through the carbon market. So I think that's it for now. I think these are the three big areas where the state of Washington is really kind of pushing the envelope on carbon offsets. Although I will note, and Kelly talked about, there's a lot going on in the purely voluntary space as well. Big corporations here like Microsoft and so on and so forth. But I think that's it for me. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. I think, the role that legislation and also that some of these court cases can make in this can't really be overstated. I know with California, we saw a lot of sort of market contractions and some activity based on the fact that for a while people weren't sure if the cap and trade program was viable in the long term. But luckily, I think a lot of that has been resolved with the new legislative decisions. But with that, I'm going to move on to Sheldon Zakreski. He's Director of Asset Management at the Climate Trust and also now Chief Operating Officer. So congratulations. And the Climate Trust, as I think you've heard, works in Oregon and Washington and also in California and also on the voluntary markets. But I will let Sheldon sort of speak more to that.
Great, thanks, Kelly, and thank you everyone for participating on the webinar today. So just maybe I'll give you a bit of background about the Climate Trust, since Kelly had mentioned the Oregon CO2 standard. And the Climate Trust is a 20-year-old nonprofit, and we were actually formed, I guess, in response to Oregon passing the CO2 standard legislation, because one of the compliance options for new energy facilities is to mitigate their sort of projected 30-year emissions, and they can do that by sort of what's known as a monetary pathway. And I like to kind of basically sort of describe it that it works essentially kind of like a carbon tax against a projected 30-year emissions of a power plant. And so over about the last 15 years, we've received about $30 million in payments for about 14 facilities. We got the first payment in 2001, and excuse me, we got the last payment about several months ago. And as I'll maybe talk about when I sort of shift to some of my observations, I think that there's probably a good chance that that'll be the last mitigation payment that we will receive under Oregon's CO2 standard. So I guess there's probably about four, I think, kind of trends, observations I wanted to kind of call out with respect to offsets in in North America. And I think as Kelly's sort of slide presented, I mean, forestry is really dominating the California offset market, and I think it'll only grow, over the next couple of years and then have an even more dominant position. So just basically, as the sort of latest data indicates, there's been about 62 million forestry offsets issued under the California program. So actually it's up above a 70% market share by volume. And there's about another 50 million offsets that are currently under review by the Air Resources Board. And pretty much all of this volume that's kind of under review by the Air Resources Board, sort of awaiting their decision, is pretty much forestry volume. In addition to that, there are several large projects from Alaska that have been in the works over the last couple of years, and I'd expect those projects to kind of progress and get to the point where they submit their verification reports to ARB for review. So, I don't think it's hard to imagine that if you look by sort of the end of 2018, that you could see forestry offsets surpassing about 1 million tons of issuance, and maybe at or above an 80% share of the California market by volume by the end of this year. The second thing I probably want to call out is that Oregon has a really good shot of becoming the 4th member of the Western Climate Initiative, and that's the linked market of which California, Ontario, and Quebec are currently the 3 jurisdictions participating in. There's been a lot of groundwork in Oregon done around cap and trade going back to 2016. So, even though you may hear folks saying, hey, it's not appropriate to debate such a big and weighty bill in a short 5-week session, it's not like this bill's kind of being suddenly dropped out of the air. There's been debates for 2 previous sessions about cap and trade. There's been a lot of work and a lot of effort by stakeholders. So this bill is really well positioned, and I think it's also just a priority because it is one of those bills that could generate revenue that doesn't require sort of a 60% yes vote to kind of avoid a ballot challenge. And that's a pretty important thing, just sort of given how our sort of state constitution works. Another thing I guess I wanted to sort of say is aggregation is in again. And I guess I sort of say, in again, because I think this was something, aggregation was sort of a hot topic several years ago when we were sort of thinking about federal cap and trade and how could we make it so that smaller forest landowners, which are the dominant landowner type, in the U.S. and farmers could participate in the offset market. And why I say it's in again is that in Ontario, which is currently working on their offset protocols, they have a pathway to allow for aggregation. In Oregon's cap and trade bills, they have specifically called out aggregation as something that's allowable. And in the voluntary market, starting to see traction with aggregation, particularly around avoided conversion of grasslands projects. And finally, looking to California, one of the sort of key debates in California last year when they were looking to extend their cap and trade bill to 2030 was about what's a California offset, what isn't a California offset, and sort of trying to make a concerted effort to increase California offset supply. And well, they've set up an offset task force, and a lot of folks have kind of framed about this in the context of, well, how could we look at new offset protocols? I think it's maybe important to remember that when California was initially setting up its cap and trade program several years ago, one of the big reasons why they picked the 4 protocols that they picked to be sort of the initial offset protocols, those being urban forestry, ozone depleting substances, livestock digesters, and forestry, is because those were project types that were likely to occur in California. And looking forward, they've added the rice protocol. There's urban forestry, but they haven't issued anything. So one of the things this offset task force could look at could be how they could allow aggregation and maybe encourage some of these smaller project types to take place in in California. And then I think the last thing I wanted to sort of maybe like kind of point out, we're already seeing it in California, but I think, we'll start to see it increasingly in the voluntary market is that natural and working lands are going to be where the offsets are coming from going forward. As Kelly kind of noted, you still see a lot of significant methane volumes. There's a lot of those landfill gas projects that came online in anticipation of federal cap and trade, but the crediting period for a lot of those projects will be expiring. I think you also couple that with that energy prices, just given the abundance of natural gas in the states, are pretty low. And so I think those factors kind of work as a disincentive, say, towards further landfill gas projects, dairy digester projects. And then, with there being uncertainty about sort of supply for non-California offsets in the kind of post-2020 California market, speaking specifically about coal mine methane, it's hard to sort of see there being a, increase in methane utilization projects. And so I think, looking, in towards the kind of next decade, I think a lot of the demand and the interest for offsets will, largely be focused on land-based projects. So thanks a lot for your time, and looking forward to any questions anybody has about my talking points.
Thank you so much, Sheldon. I think too, something we've seen, at least working with these reports with forestry, is that there's also just greater sort of familiarity and understanding of what forestry offsets and projects actually do, which I think has also sort of helped the market in the long term, because they are a bit typically more complex, I think, than some other project types. But anyway, I'm going to move on to our last panelist, Alistair Handley, and let me just see if the volume works.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Oh, yep, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Hello, everybody. Thanks for your time. Kelly, sorry I was a little late, but my session that I was in was running over. I have a couple of slides for some context, if you're able to let me take control of the screen.
Let me share that with you really quickly.
Okay. Let me know. Okay.
Yeah, you should see a pop-up right now.
Yeah, you should see the screen now. Let me know if you do.
Yep, I can see it.
All right. Excuse me. Well, good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you are in the world today. Alistair Handley. I'm the president of a company called Climate Smart Group, and we're an associate. The company Climate Smart Group has a series of associate members that work predominantly in the Canadian greenhouse gas emission reduction markets, but we also have some work that's going on in the United States and in Brazil, and looks like we'll be branching out into South America as well. Now, what I want to do is provide you with some context for the discussion or the conversation I want to have on primarily what's going on in Canada in the Alberta offset market, and it will provide a bit of context about our organization as well. So we're of the opinion or belief that ecosystem markets are built on three pillars, regulatory frameworks being, a key pillar, project development being a key component from the offset development side, of course, and then verification. Our associates have a great deal of experience in framework development and have worked on Canada's federal program back in the days of Kyoto, Turning the Corner framework. We've worked on components of Alberta's offset market framework, specifically around protocol development. We recently wrote Newfoundland and Labrador's offset framework. They're a province in Eastern Canada. And we're currently working with a number of organizations developing Monsanto's carbon accounting insetting framework to help them reach their carbon neutral goal in 2021. And overall, we've worked on collaboratively on about 11 different methodologies, 5 in the agricultural sector, 6 in the industrial and waste management sectors. On the project development side, we've completed over 47 carbon projects, I'll say verifications in the Alberta market. We currently work on behalf of over 2,500 farm clients that manage 3 million hectares of land, or in acres, that's about 8.4 million acres of land. And we've generated about 3.4 million credits, and our clients have earned over $36 million Canadian. We were and are engaged in trying to get some emission reductions out of rice cultivation in the Mid-South, and some nutrient emission reductions are also underway in the U.S. Corn Belt, and we're working in conjunction with a number of organizations on that, including Sheldon's, who I think we're making progress. Sheldon, I know you're on the line. Verifications, we've done 60 industrial projects, over 150 regulated facility emission reduction verifications, or emission verifications, and as you can see here, 29 verifications in the agricultural sector, conservation cropping, nutrient emission reduction in Canada, and enteric emission reduction projects. What does it actually look like from an aggregation standpoint? This is a map of Western Canada. Alberta's in the middle, and all the red that you can see are clients or fields that are in our aggregation system. And this would be zooming in where you can see individual fields that are about 160 acres in total. Our clients, our 2,500 clients that manage the lands, work land that is owned by over 16,000 individuals. So from an aggregation perspective, we have to deal with a lot of data around changing land ownership, data collection, making sure that people are doing the work right, making sure we're collecting the right data, and all the supporting evidence required to confirm that we actually have emission reductions. So in Alberta, we're actually very bullish on what's going on in Alberta right now. The market here has been in place since 2007. It was the first compliance market in North America, long before California's market. It was the first market in the world to allow aggregation or program of activities. Just to give you some context, the first aggregated credits in Alberta were registered in early 2008. The first credits issued under the CDM and the program of activities was in December of 2012. And so the market had a learn by doing approach. There used to be about 30 protocols that we could use in the marketplace, but a number of those have been removed because not only do we have a market for offsets, and we have a regulatory obligation for large organizations to reduce emissions, the government here has also introduced a carbon tax, really a pay at the pump. And so offset protocols that were able to generate credits from things like fuel switching are no longer able to create credits. In terms of the rest of Canada, we look out to Ontario and Quebec, and I'm not sure that we share a lot of optimism right now for what's happening out there around protocol development. Climate Action Reserve and their team is working very hard to get those protocols developed, but the folks on our team that are working on them are having issues. They're having challenges with the governments. They're having challenges with a number of issues that are being posed by the Quebec government and the government of Ontario. So we're not sure when those protocols will be approved and when people will be able to generate credits from that space. Right now, I think it's just fair to say that they're well behind schedule. With respect to credits from the agricultural sector, although Ontario has put forward a plan to allow for aggregation, the previous Minister of Environment also sent very clear signals that credits, excuse me, credits from sort of the agricultural and some protocols likely would not be allowed into their compliance system and would in fact be purchased by the government and the government's own carbon neutral initiative. And the exact details of what that would look like in terms of a demand or price side are unknown. So within the context of Ontario and Quebec, we're not sure where that's really going. I think Quebec's path is a little clear. The other issue we have in Canada is that the government of Ontario, there's an election happening, and the current party isn't expected to win. And the Progressive Conservative Party, the right-leaning party, has said that they're going to scrap the cap and trade program in Ontario. Now, we don't really know what that means. It could just be political posturing. So there's a few negative notes in Ontario and Quebec. On a more positive note, the federal government of Canada has implemented carbon pricing across Canada under their climate leadership platform. And what they've indicated is that every province in Canada must have a price on carbon this year, starting at $10 a ton at a minimum, increasing by $10 a year up to $50 a ton, which will come into place for the 2022 compliance period. So we see potential increasing values in carbon credits. We see this freeing up or enabling projects which right now aren't economically viable to start. And we think there's going to be more demand over time. British Columbia has their carbon tax. They've got an LNG carbon program, and their government there is carbon neutral. Saskatchewan and Manitoba both indicated, have both come up with their climate leadership plans, and they're both looking to the biological sector for emission reduction, so forestry and the agricultural sector. And I can't speak to what's going on in the far provinces in the Maritimes. With respect to forestry projects in Canada, Alberta currently doesn't have any forestry projects. It has no approved forestry methodologies. British Columbia has had some forestry projects, but they were heavily scrutinized by the Auditor General, and it took the wind out of a lot of people's sails in that space. Ontario and Quebec will move forward with forestry projects. So I think in a nutshell, we see optimism in parts of Canada around carbon pricing. We certainly see increasing demand in Alberta. Annually, the compliance obligation in Alberta in 2017 was about 17 million tons. Under the new system, which just came into place this year, it could rise to as much as 36 megatons in 2019. As a developer of agricultural credits, when we look south of the border, we're not optimistic around agricultural credits being permitted into a compliance market, or compliance markets having the infrastructure or regulatory framework that will allow aggregation at a level that really truly reduces development costs. We saw that with the rice cultivation project protocol approved by the ARB. When we sat down and really took a look at it, there was no interest in proceeding with the project because it really wasn't economically feasible. What we do see in the States, though, is we see more companies looking for ways to reduce emissions, but do so through sustainable supply chains. And that's what we see with Monsanto. And we've recently been in touch with a organization that purchased 35,000 acres of cropland, which they're converting to a large organic farm. And part of that is sustainability, supply chain sustainability, but also potentially emission reductions. So I think I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that's informative. I think questions will be easier to answer if there's any specific ones. So I'll turn it back to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Alistair.
No problem.
And I'm excited you mentioned the progress that's going on with trying to figure out the protocols in Ontario and Quebec, because I wasn't actually sure what the status of that is. So now I guess I'll know not to be waiting too eagerly for that. Let me see. So I'll make myself the presenter again. And I think right now we're going to turn it over to questions. I do know we're a little over time, so if attendees don't mind just waiting for, hanging around for another 10 minutes, then we'll do that. And if you have to leave right now, please do just write a question in the question box. And if we don't get to it, I can share it with myself and the panelists, and we'll make sure to get back to you via email. But I'm going to have one of my colleagues, Philip Rothrock, ask the questions, so I'm not having to ask questions and think of answers at the same time.
Hello, everyone. This is Philip Rothrock, and I'm going to read out one of the first questions we have here. This question is for Sheldon. What are the options for private forest landowners in the eastern U.S. with regard to the offset market?
Just a reminder, you might be muted.
Sheldon, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. I'm sorry. For some reason, I was clicking the unmute button several times, and it wouldn't let me speak. So the options for forest landowners in the eastern United States. There still are options for the California market through 2020. It does not have sort of any geographical restriction on it, and I know that there's definitely work on some sort of clarifying language, grandfathering language, that if you can get a project registered prior to 2021, that it could be grandfathered in, so it's not subject to sort of the geographical restrictions that California has in its post-2020 market. And then also, depending on specific location, I mean, there are voluntary buyers that do have an interest in forestry projects, but that kind of relates down to, I guess, the exact state you're in.
Thank you very much. The next question we have is for Bill. You mentioned that in Washington, there's an Environmental Policy Act in the state, and we were wondering what other states have this. Do you think there's a potential offsets are the same there?
Sorry. Thanks for the question. I'm unfortunately not an expert in the big state, of course, it does is California with CEQA, the California Act. And there have been a number of cases I am aware of where they've at least tried. I'm not sure what the litigation status in California, but they've moved forward in a similar path. I think it's pretty unique. Unfortunately, I'm probably just not able to answer the question because I'm not aware of anyone's other than Washington and California, but I'm not as familiar with the East Coast status on that.
Okay, great. So this next question is for everyone. How do you see the demand in the voluntary market for VCS gold standard projects changing?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that. I think that there's a potential for the demand coming out of the voluntary market to increase substantially, depending upon what the International Civil Aviation Organization approves as compliance units under CORSIA. They're still undecided. There was a rumor that they were going to actually allow the approved registries, if you will, and then any credit from those registries could be used as compliance units. But it's still very unclear. If CORSIA will allow those units into the market, then demand will increase slowly at first and will definitely pick up around the latter half of 2023 or Q1 2024.
Anyone have any other thoughts? I guess if no one else has any thoughts, we'll move on to the next question. So this next question. Oh, hold on. We
looks
have
like,
a response.
Let me try and I might have muted someone by accident. Sorry, Phil, you can go.
That's no problem. I think that there's two Phils on the call now, so I think maybe I was the victim of that. Yeah, on the just a quick comment on the voluntary side. I think one of the things that we really don't quite yet have our arms around well is what the impact of the Paris Agreement is going to be as that rolls forward on the voluntary markets. And so there's a lot of work being done by some of the European-based foundations, particularly Gold Standard, is doing a lot of work to see if they can begin to look at some of the co-benefit side of the credits as well, in order to still be relevant in an environment where a lot more emissions are actually covered by a trading system. And so I think it's a great question, and I don't know the answer, but certainly as that agreement rolls out over the next couple of years, it will have an impact on both how we account for voluntary projects, but also how people engage with those projects and what the demand looks like.
Great. Excellent. So if we don't have any lurking responses, we'll go to the next one. So this one is, how will California's compliance forestry projects be impacted by the most recent version of the protocol? How much could this reduce development, or how much could this reduce development in the future?
I don't know if you want to take a stab at that. If you're speaking, I don't know if we can hear you.
Sorry, yeah, this is Sheldon. I will try to take a stab at at that one. Yeah, it's a tricky question, I guess, to sort of answer. I mean, I think the last updates to the protocol, definitely will result in a slowdown in the lower 48 states. There's going to be just sort of fewer projects as a result of the change. But I mean, overall, I don't know how you're going to necessarily see that impact in the marketplace, because the other side of the coin with the last protocol update is that it had opened up Alaska, and I know there is a definitely a sudden interest on the part of several native corporations, and a lot of the forests they have up there are just very significantly large acreages. And so we'll be seeing a lot of those projects which have very large multi-million issuances coming online.
Great. Did anyone else want to add on to that?
No, I'm good.
Great. We'll move on to the next question. So this is back to Bill. You mentioned that there was a pushback on the new law, and I was wondering if there are any new lessons that you can learn from the California experience.
Well, yeah, and just to clarify, one key point is that the Clean Air Rule actually isn't a new law. It's an administrative action being done under existing authority. So, and that does make it a lot trickier. We really had to sort of thread a needle with, the authority we did it under is essentially equivalent to the federal Clean Air Act. In the state of Washington, we have a Washington Clean Air Act. So we basically did it under sort of a, if you will, sort of old school, smokestack air pollution type of authority. And yeah, it just meant sort of, like I say, making a lot of choices that, probably first and foremost among them not being able to do sort of a full-on allowance-based cap and trade system. So yeah, I'm not sure there are a lot of lessons learned. It's actually fairly unique. We are, to the best of our knowledge, the first state to try and do an economy-wide cap and reduce program under existing authority, as opposed to putting in place either a new law or of course the AB 32 like broad authority that California put in place. So they're kind of different beasts.
Thanks for the answer and the clarification. So this next one is for Alistair. You mentioned that you're working with Monsanto, and we just wanted to step it back and say, what is insetting?
That is a good question. So if we look at how companies historically have purchased or generated credits to apply against their carbon footprint, they've typically gone into the voluntary market to do so. Within the context of the voluntary market, there are out-of-pocket expenses, registry costs, and I'll say perhaps a higher level of complexity that an organization might want to go through in order to get emission reductions that they can count against their carbon footprint. So what insetting is, and insetting is occurring in other companies like L'Oreal. It's really where a company is working within its circle of influence, either in its supply chain or its customer base, to provide an incentive to do them to change a practice or practices that will result in either sequestration of GHG emissions or reduction of GHG emissions. So it's really a system whereby the organizations are bypassing the market per se and going directly to people that they can that they work with in the supply chain or their client base. It is not a get out of jail free card, and it's not I'll say a greenwashing program in the context of what Monsanto is trying to do. So Monsanto is developing this carbon accounting framework which has basic carbon accounting principles. So principles around additionality, around permanence, around verification, and within that framework, that regulatory framework, protocols will be vetted into that framework, and then Monsanto, through its mainly its farming clients, will be encouraged to implement a change in practice that will result in emission reductions. They'll look at capturing that data and then quantifying those emission reductions. If I was to put it another way, I would say it's a bit like field to market, but field to market on steroids in terms of the advances that they're making with their systems and data systems and grower engagement.
Great.
Does that answer the question?
I think that does. Thank you so much, Alistair. I know I'm cognizant that we're sort of a little over time at the moment, so there are additional questions that we haven't gotten to yet, but I did want to say that I will sort of collect all of those and share them with the panelists and get back to everyone whose question wasn't answered just now. I just wanted to finish this with one question of my own, which is just if you were to see any political decision or policy occur in 2018, what would you like to see if you could only choose one? Go.
Washington State, takes on cap and trade so we could have a West Coast market. Do something about that, Bill?
Yeah, I mean, really, carbon pricing up and down the Pacific Coast, you know, that would just be wonderful, whatever shape that may take.
Yeah, I think I'd look outside of North America, and I'd look to the Pacific Alliance countries in South America, being able to move forward with their standardized MRV system and market linking that they're discussing, and start to move forward on projects that are starting down here in this part of the world.
Great, and I think for my answer, it'd probably be to see how offsets, especially those from the voluntary markets, could be incorporated into the International Aviation Program, ICAO's CORSIA. But anyway, thank you so much to all the panelists who participated. I know I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone else on the webinar did as well. Just as a reminder, we will have this recorded, and so you will be able to listen again as much as you want online. It will be posted in a few days on the landing page for the Fertile Ground State of Forest Carbon Finance 2017 report. And once again, we will follow up on any questions that we haven't had the chance to answer already. But with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending and hope you have a great day.
Thanks. Thank you very much.